"Ma'am, I don't have time for this," Captain Walker sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. "Either you move, or I have you removed." The first-class cabin fell into a thick silence, tension crackling in the air like static before a storm. Olivia Carter clenched her jaw, every fiber of her being screaming at her to keep calm. She had spent years navigating spaces where she wasn't welcome, rooms filled with men like Walker who saw her as an inconvenience, not a rightful occupant. She straightened her shoulders, exhaling slowly. "I paid for this seat. I'm not moving." Walker's smirk widened, a slow, satisfied expression that made her stomach twist. "All right, then." He turned to a flight attendant. "Get security." Gasps rippled through the cabin. Passengers shifted uncomfortably, some averting their eyes, others pretending not to notice. Olivia sat still, her pulse steady, her mind already calculating her next move. The pilot thought he was making an example of her. He had no idea he was making the biggest mistake of his life. Minutes later, 2 uniformed security officers arrived, their expressions unreadable. "Ma'am, you need to come with us." Olivia didn't flinch. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out her phone, her fingers moving with practiced ease. "Before you do anything, I suggest you call your corporate office," she said smoothly, lifting her gaze to Walker. "Because you just kicked the CEO's daughter off her own airline." The color drained from Walker's face. "Wait, what?" The flight attendant gasped audibly, while nearby passengers whispered in shock. Olivia arched a brow, lips curving into a knowing smile. "You heard me. My father owns this airline." She turned to the security officers. "Now, do you really want to be the guys who manhandled the boss's daughter?" The officers exchanged uneasy glances. Walker's confidence shattered in real time, his throat bobbing as he struggled to regain control of the situation. That's impossible." Olivia took a step forward, voice low, laced with authority. "It's not just possible, it's reality. And trust me, Captain, by the time we land, you won't be employed anymore." Walker's eyes darted around the cabin, looking for an escape that didn't exist, because in that moment, he realized he wasn't the one in control. He never was. But before we dive deeper into this wild story, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below, and if you love stories about justice and karma, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Let's get into it. JFK International Airport was alive with the usual chaos of a New York evening. Travelers bustled through the terminals, their rolling suitcases clattering against the polished floors. Overhead announcements echoed through the air, boarding calls mixing with hurried conversations, and the occasional frustrated sigh of a delayed passenger. The scent of overpriced airport coffee mingled with the crisp, conditioned air, and neon-lit signs directed travelers to their gates like glowing beacons in a sea of motion. It was business as usual at one of the busiest airports in the world, but for Olivia Carter, it was just another stop in her never-ending cycle of travel, meetings, and high-stakes negotiation. Dressed in an effortlessly chic designer pantsuit, Olivia carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had long ago proven herself in rooms where she wasn't always welcome. Her sleek, dark hair framed her face, and despite the exhaustion tugging at her features, her eyes remained sharp, calculating, always reading the energy of a room before stepping into it. This was the final stretch of an exhausting week, back-to-back meetings with international investors, a groundbreaking deal secured, and now, finally, a flight back home to Los Angeles where she could steal a few days of rest before diving into the next challenge. A first-class ticket awaited her, a small luxury she had more than earned, though she knew that no amount of money could shield her entirely from the microaggressions that often came with occupying spaces where people like her weren't expected to be. She had long since perfected the art of brushing them off with a composed smile, refusing to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. She strode toward the check-in counter at her gate, adjusting the strap of her sleek leather carry-on. The moment she approached, she noticed the shift, the subtle but undeniable tension that flickered across the airline agent's face. It was brief, But Olivia didn't miss much. The agent, a woman in her late 30s with neatly pinned blonde hair, barely glanced at Olivia before shifting her eyes to the computer screen in front of her. Olivia handed over her boarding pass, her manicured fingers resting lightly on the counter. The agent scanned it, then frowned. Her hesitation stretched just a beat too long, her eyes darting toward a coworker, before finally looking back up at Olivia. "Miss Carter?" she started, her voice professional but strained. "There seems to be a mix-up with your seat." Olivia didn't blink. Here we go, she thought. "A mix-up?" she asked, her voice smooth but edged with authority. "My seat was confirmed when I checked in." The agent's fingers hovered over the keyboard, typing something before glancing toward a supervisor standing a few feet away. The supervisor, a middle-aged man with graying temples and a stiff posture, avoided Olivia's gaze and spoke to another employee in hushed tones. Olivia felt the unease ripple through her body. She had been in enough of these situations to recognize the signs. They didn't expect her to be here. They were looking for a way to make her disappear, quietly, without causing a scene. The agent cleared her throat, clearly uncomfortable. "I'm very sorry, Miss Carter. It looks like your seat was reassigned." Olivia exhaled slowly, keeping her posture relaxed even as irritation bubbled beneath the surface. "Reassigned to whom?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. The agent hesitated again. I don't have that information available at the moment, but I can find you another seat." Olivia leaned in slightly, lowering her voice just enough to ensure she was heard but not mistaken for causing a disruption. "I paid for a first-class ticket. I confirmed my seat. I expect to sit in the seat I booked." The agent swallowed, her discomfort growing. Behind her, the supervisor finally looked over, eyes narrowing slightly before he stepped forward. Olivia turned her gaze to him as he approached, already bracing herself for the next excuse, the next fabricated reason to deny her the space she had rightfully earned. Her gut told her something wasn't right, and she had learned long ago to trust that instinct. The sound of polished leather shoes striking the tile floor announced his arrival before he even spoke. Captain Richard Walker, a man who carried himself with the authority of someone who had never once questioned his place in the world, strode toward the counter, his crisp pilot's uniform pressed to perfection, gold stripes gleaming on his sleeves. He was in his mid-50s, tall and broad-shouldered, with sharp blue eyes that had once belonged to an Air Force officer and a jawline that seemed permanently clenched. His short-cropped silver hair and rigid posture gave him the air of someone who saw himself as a relic of an era where men like him commanded absolute respect. Everything about him, from the way he moved to the way he surveyed the room, screamed control. His eyes landed on Olivia, then flicked to the airline agent, and in that single glance he had already decided exactly what was happening here. He exhaled through his nose, the smallest shake of his head betraying his irritation as he came to a stop beside the counter. "What's the issue here?" His voice was clipped, professional, but laced with impatience. The agent hesitated, casting a wary glance at Olivia before responding. "There was a mix-up with Miss Carter's seat, Captain. We're trying to—" Walker didn't let her finish. His gaze settled fully on Olivia, his expression unreadable but his meaning clear. "Is there a problem, ma'am?" he asked, his tone making it obvious that in his mind there already was. Olivia met his stare with practiced ease, refusing to shrink under his scrutiny. "Apparently, my confirmed first-class seat was reassigned," she said, her voice smooth, controlled. Walker let out a slow breath, as if he had already decided this conversation was a waste of his time. "Ma'am, first class is reserved for paying customers with valid reservations," he said, his voice neutral but dismissive, as if he were explaining something painfully obvious. Olivia arched a single brow, unimpressed. "I am a paying customer," she said evenly, holding up her ticket. "And this is my valid reservation." For a moment there was silence. Walker's jaw tightened slightly, but his expression remained unreadable. Then, as if deciding he had indulged this conversation long enough, he exhaled sharply. "I'm afraid that's not the case," he said, his voice taking on an edge of finality. "I don't know what happened with your booking, but first class is full." We'll need to seat you elsewhere." The way he said it, so matter-of-fact, as if it were simply a minor inconvenience, sent a slow burn of irritation through Olivia's veins. She had dealt with men like him before, men who believed certain spaces belonged to them, and people who looked like her were merely intruders. She had spent her entire career forcing doors open that had been built to keep her out, and she wasn't about to let a self-important pilot act like she didn't belong in a seat she had rightfully paid for. She kept her posture relaxed, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. "And where exactly do you plan on seating me?" she asked, folding her arms. Walker's lips pressed into a thin line. "I'm sure we can find you something in economy," he said, as if he were doing her a favor. The audacity of it was almost laughable. Olivia tilted her head slightly, studying him, watching the way he refused to look at her ticket, refused to acknowledge that she had every right to be in first class. He wasn't operating on facts. He had made up his mind the second he saw her standing there. She didn't move. "That's not going to work for me," she said simply. Walker's eyes darkened slightly, his patience wearing thin. "Ma'am?" "I don't have time for this," he said, his voice cooling. "If you won't move voluntarily, we'll have to take further action." Olivia felt the tension in the air shift. The agent beside him shifted uncomfortably. A few nearby passengers were watching now, some pretending not to eavesdrop, others staring outright. The energy in the room had changed, the quiet weight of unspoken rules pressing against the moment. Walker straightened slightly, adjusting his sleeves, exuding the kind of authority that had gone unchallenged for most of his life. "I need you to make a decision," he said, his voice low, controlled. "Either you move, or I have you removed." The challenge hung between them, electric, charged with something deeper than just a dispute over a seat. Olivia knew what was happening here. She had seen it before, but what Walker didn't know, what he couldn't possibly realize, was that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Olivia didn't flinch. She held her ground, her grip tightening around the handle of her carry-on. The weight of the stairs pressing in from the surrounding passengers was almost tangible, but she refused to shrink under it. The quiet murmurs, the subtle shifting in seats, the way the flight attendants avoided eye contact. It was all so familiar. This was not just about a seat. It was about power, about control, about a man who had already decided that she didn't belong and expected her to comply without question. Walker exhaled sharply, clearly irritated by her refusal to move. His eyes darkened with something colder now, something edged with unspoken contempt. "Listen, sweetheart," he said, his voice dropping into a condescending drawl, his smirk sharp and confident. "First class isn't for people like you." The words cut through the air like a blade. A few passengers gasped quietly, but no one spoke. Olivia could feel the tension shift, the silent approval of some, the discomfort of others. It wasn't just what he said, it was the ease with which he said it, the certainty that there would be no consequences. She felt the heat rise in her chest, the familiar bitter taste of injustice curling at the edges of her composure. She tilted her head slightly, assessing him, the smug way he squared his shoulders, the expectation that she would back down, that she would fold, step aside, let him win. Instead, she smiled, a slow, deliberate expression that held no amusement. "And what kind of people would that be, Captain?" Her voice was dangerously calm, her gaze steady. For the first time, Walker hesitated. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but she saw it. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not like this. His jaw clenched. "People who understand how to follow orders," he said finally, his voice tight, his patience unraveling. Olivia's lips pressed together in a thin line. "I paid for this seat. I have a right to be here." Walker's smirk returned, colder this time. "Not anymore, you..." He turned to one of the flight attendants, jerking his head in Olivia's direction. "Get security." A ripple of unease passed through the nearby passengers, but no one objected. No one stood up. Olivia watched as the flight attendant hesitated for a split second before obeying, disappearing toward the front of the plane. The energy in the cabin shifted again, the quiet, uncomfortable weight of what was happening settling over them all. Walker turned back to Olivia, arms crossed over his broad chest. "You can do this the easy way or the hard way," he said, his voice low. "I don't care which." Olivia's pulse pounded, but she refused to let him see any crack in her resolve. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice cool, unwavering. Walker let out a short, humorless laugh. "No, sweetheart," he said, leaning in slightly, his voice barely above a whisper. "The mistake was thinking you could sit up here with the rest of us." The flight attendant returned, 2 uniformed security officers following close behind. The taller of the two, a heavy-set man with thinning hair, stepped forward. "Ma'am, I need you to come with us." Olivia remained still, her body taut with controlled anger. "On what grounds?" Walker's expression sharpened. "You're being disruptive." She let out a slow breath. This wasn't just about power. It was about humiliation, about making her small. The taller security officer hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, but Walker's presence loomed beside him. "Ma'am, please, don't make this harder than it needs to be." Olivia didn't move. Walker's patience snapped. Without warning, his hand clamped down on her shoulder, yanking her upward with enough force to throw her slightly off balance. Gasps rippled through the cabin as she stumbled, her carry-on slipping from her grasp, hitting the floor with a dull thud. "Get her out of here," Walker barked. The security officers moved in, gripping her arms, their holds firm but not quite rough. Olivia barely had time to react before she felt herself being dragged forward. Her designer dress, tailored to perfection, snagged against the armrest as she was pulled past it, the fabric tearing with an audible rip. She heard it before she felt it, the sharp, humiliating sound of something expensive being ruined. Her breath caught in her throat, her vision tunneling for a brief second. The whispers grew louder. "She should have just moved," someone muttered. Another voice, softer, hesitant. "This isn't right." But no one stopped it. No one stood up. Her heels scraped against the carpeted floor as she was pulled down the aisle, past the wide-eyed faces of passengers who would later say they didn't want to get involved. Walker watched her go, his expression impassive, as if this was nothing more than a minor inconvenience, a routine matter of dealing with an uncooperative passenger. And as Olivia stepped off the plane, humiliated, furious, but unbroken, she made a silent promise. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Olivia's heels clicked against the polished floor of the jet bridge as she stepped into the terminal, the cold, artificial lighting making the rage burning inside her feel even hotter. Her hands trembled as she adjusted the strap of her torn dress, the humiliation still fresh, raw, searing into her skin. Her pulse pounded in her ears, but her mind was crystal clear. She had spent a lifetime controlling her emotions in rooms full of powerful men who underestimated her. But this was different. This wasn't just business. This was personal. She reached into her bag, fingers wrapping around her phone, gripping it so tightly that her nails dug into her palm. Her reflection in the glass windows showed a woman who looked composed, unshaken, but beneath the surface, a storm was brewing. She swiped at her screen, found the number and pressed call. The line barely rang once before a deep, steady voice answered. "Olivia!" Just hearing his voice made her breath hitch. Her father had always been a pillar of control, a force of nature contained only by his own will. She had never known him to panic, never seen him lose control, not even when the world tried to break him. But tonight, there was an edge in his tone. He already knew something was wrong. She swallowed, steadying herself. "Dad!" A beat of silence. Then, in that same calm, controlled voice, he asked, "What happened?" That was all it took. Her grip tightened on the phone, and for the first time since she was dragged off that plane, she allowed herself to feel it fully. The anger, the humiliation, the way that man had looked at her as if she didn't belong, as if she were an inconvenience he could discard without consequence. She forced herself to inhale slowly, to keep her voice level, but there was no mistaking the fire beneath it. "They kicked me off the plane," she said, her tone clipped, controlled. "I had a confirmed first-class seat, and they told me it had been reassigned. I refused to move. The pilot decided I was a problem. He had security pull me out of my seat. He put his hands on me, Dad." She heard the sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, but he didn't speak yet. He was processing, calculating. He never reacted emotionally. Not in public, not in business, and certainly not when it mattered most. That was something she had learned from him. She kept going. "I didn't do anything. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten anyone. I just wouldn't let him walk all over me, and that was enough for him to decide I needed to be removed. I was dragged down that aisle like I was nothing, like I didn't belong there." There was another pause, but this time it was different. When Nathaniel Carter finally spoke, his voice was lower, quieter, laced with something that sent a chill down Olivia's spine. "Tell me his name again." "Walker, Captain Richard Walker." Silence. Then, "Where are you right now?" "Still at JFK," she said. "I want you to stay there. Don't leave the airport. Don't talk to anyone. I'll handle it." Olivia's fingers flexed around the phone. "Dad, I don't want this to be swept under the rug. This can't be another incident where they apologize, issue a statement, and keep moving like nothing happened. Not this time." His response was instant. "It won't be." She believed him. Because when Nathaniel Carter said he would handle something, he meant it, and he didn't lose. David Reynolds had dealt with crises before. As the CEO of one of the world's largest airlines, he had weathered everything from technical failures to public scandals, but nothing had ever sent his phone into a full-blown meltdown like this. His assistant burst into his office, her face pale, her voice rushed. "Sir, we have a serious situation." He didn't even look up from his laptop. "Is it a security breach?" "It's Olivia Carter." That made him pause. Slowly he leaned back in his chair, brows furrowing. "Nathaniel Carter's daughter?" "Yes, sir. She was removed from a first-class flight tonight by Captain Walker." The words barely registered before his desk phone rang. His assistant's eyes flicked to the caller ID, then back to him, her face tight with something bordering on panic. "It's Mr. Carter." David's mouth went dry. He stared at the flashing light on his phone, his brain already running through damage control strategies. This was bad, worse than bad. He pressed the button, forcing his voice into the calm, practiced neutrality that had saved him in more boardroom fights than he could count. "Nathaniel, explain to me." Nathaniel Carter's voice came through the receiver like a blade, low and controlled. "Why your airline allowed a racist pilot to physically remove my daughter from her rightful first-class seat." David swallowed. His PR instincts kicked in. "Nathaniel, I only just heard about this. I can assure you we are investigating." "You don't need an investigation," Nathaniel cut him off. "What you need is a plan. Right now, you and I both know exactly what happened. My daughter was humiliated on your airline in front of a full plane of witnesses because one of your pilots decided she didn't belong. And unless you want this to be the kind of PR disaster that buries your company, you need to start talking about solutions." David pinched the bridge of his nose. "Nathaniel, No." Nathaniel's voice was pure steel. "You listen, because I've already started making calls, and I promise you, this isn't just going away." David could feel his pulse thudding in his throat. He glanced at his assistant, who was already pulling up the incident report on her tablet, her face tight with panic. "I will personally ensure that every major news outlet in the country sees that footage," Nathaniel continued, his tone calm but ice cold. "And I guarantee that by tomorrow morning, your shareholders will be asking why their stocks are plummeting over an incident that could have been avoided if you actually train your employees to handle black passengers with the same respect you give everyone else." David exhaled, his hand tightening into a fist on his desk. This was a disaster. He had known Nathaniel Carter for years, respected him even, but one thing was clear. This wasn't a conversation. It was a warning. "I hear you," David finally said, his voice measured. "Let me get to work on this." "You have 1 hour," Nathaniel said, and then the line went dead. David barely had time to let the weight of that settle before his assistant turned the tablet toward him. "Sir, it's already online." His eyes flicked to the screen and his stomach dropped. A video, grainy, shaky, but unmistakable, was spreading across Twitter at an alarming rate. In the clip, Captain Walker stood over Olivia, his posture imposing, his voice raised. The audio was muffled, but the words were clear. "Listen, sweetheart, first class isn't for people like you." Then the screen jostled as security yanked Olivia from her seat, the sharp sound of her dress ripping cutting through the hum of shocked passengers. David's stomach turned to ice. "Sir," his assistant's voice was barely above a whisper, "this is about to go viral." And then, as if on cue, her phone buzzed with a new notification. The hashtag was already trending. Justice for Olivia. The internet moved faster than any crisis team ever could. Within an hour, the video had racked up over 1 million views, spreading like wildfire across Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. News outlets picked it up almost immediately, their headlines sharp and damning. Black billionaire dragged off her own first-class seat by racist pilot. The footage was shaky, captured by at least 3 different passengers, but the audio was the arrogance in Walker's voice, the sound of Olivia's dress tearing, the collective gasp from the passengers. It all played on loop, a gut punch that was impossible to ignore. Then came the outrage. Prominent activists flooded social media, their voices loud and unrelenting. This isn't just about Olivia Carter. This is about every black person who's ever been told they don't belong. Civil rights attorneys weighed in, dissecting the legal implications, while corporate watchdogs began pulling up the airline's hiring records, diversity reports, and past discrimination complaints. And then the celebrities jumped in. Actress Kiara Brooks, a longtime advocate for racial justice, tweeted, "Imagine if Olivia Carter wasn't rich, if she wasn't the daughter of a billionaire. Would there even be a conversation, or would she have been arrested?" NBA star Malik Rivers followed up with, "I'm done flying with this airline. We see what y'all really think of us." Music icon Lana Hayes posted an Instagram story, her face tight with frustration. "This is what we mean when we say money doesn't protect you from racism. Olivia Carter is a billionaire, and they still treated her like she was nothing." The hashtag Justice for Olivia was everywhere, climbing the trending charts at a speed that sent PR teams scrambling. Within hours, there were calls to boycott the airline, with customers flooding their official accounts, demanding answers, demanding consequences. Meanwhile, Olivia sat in the airport lounge, her phone vibrating non-stop. Texts, missed calls, emails from journalists, lawyers, people she hadn't spoken to in years. She ignored most of them, her focus razor-sharp. She scrolled through the messages from her father's team, updates on the legal action already in motion, financial pressure being applied, strategies being formed. And yet, the thing that stood out most wasn't the high-profile outrage. It was the messages from regular people. This happened to my mom last year. She didn't have a camera. She didn't have a voice. I was kicked off a flight for causing a disturbance when I asked why my seat had been reassigned. I knew why, but no one listened. This isn't just about Olivia Carter, this is about all of us. Olivia's fingers hovered over the screen. For years, she had built an empire by playing the game strategically, by picking her battles, by knowing when to walk away. But this time, walking away wasn't an option. She tapped the camera icon on her phone, took a slow breath, and hit record. "I want to talk about what happened tonight." Walker strode into the executive suite of the airline's headquarters with the swagger of a man who had spent decades being untouchable. His crisp uniform was perfectly pressed, his gold-striped sleeves a reminder of his rank, his authority. He wasn't the least bit concerned about this so-called incident that had sent the corporate office into a frenzy. If anything, he was irritated that they had dragged him in for a meeting over something so trivial. His boots echoed against the marble floor as he entered the boardroom, his smirk firmly in place. Several high-ranking executives sat around the long conference table, their faces tight, their postures stiff. In the middle of it all was David Reynolds, the airline's CEO, standing by the window, his jaw clenched as he scrolled through his phone. Walker exhaled loudly, making his presence impossible to ignore. "I assume this is about that woman on my flight," he said casually, sliding into a chair as if he had all the time in the world. "Look, gentlemen, I don't know what kind of calls you've been getting, but I did my job. She was causing a disruption, and I handled it." No one responded right away. The tension in the room was thick, the silence pressing. Walker's smirk faltered slightly. He expected someone to back him up, to agree that he had done what was necessary. Instead, David Reynolds slowly turned, leveling him with a stare that was cold enough to send a flicker of unease down his spine. "You handled it?" Reynolds repeated, his voice dangerously low. Walker scoffed. "She wouldn't listen. She refused to move. I had no choice." He leaned back in his chair, shrugging. "What else was I supposed to do? Let her think she runs my plane?" A muscle ticked in Reynolds' jaw. One of the executives, a woman in a sharp navy suit, cleared her throat. "Captain Walker, do you have any idea who that woman was?" Walker frowned, suddenly annoyed. "I don't care who she was. A passenger is a passenger. She didn't follow instructions. That's all that matters." Reynolds exhaled sharply, pinching the bridge of his nose. He wasn't a man who lost his temper easily, but the weight of this disaster was unlike anything he had dealt with before. He stepped forward, sliding his phone across the table toward Walker. "Watch this." Walker frowned but leaned forward, pressing play. The video loaded instantly, and within seconds he saw himself on screen. The angle was slightly tilted, but the audio was crystal clear. "Listen, sweetheart, first class isn't for people like you." Walker's stomach twisted as he heard his own words played back to him, the smugness in his voice unmistakable. Then came the sound of Olivia's dress ripping, the gasps from the passengers, the moment security dragged her down the aisle. The footage cut off, but the damage had already been done. He looked up, forcing a dry chuckle. "Oh, come on. You know how these things get blown out of proportion. Someone's always recording, twisting things." Reynolds slammed his hand down on the table, his patience finally snapping. "Twisting things? Walker, that clip has over 5 million views and it's only been a few hours. We are trending worldwide. Every major news outlet is running the story. Celebrities, politicians, civil rights leaders, everyone is talking about this." His voice dropped, deadly quiet. "Do you know why?" Walker swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. "Because Olivia Carter isn't just a random passenger," Reynolds continued, his voice like steel. "She's the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company, she's a public figure, and," he leaned forward, enunciating each word, "she is the daughter of Nathaniel Carter." Walker blinked. The name didn't register at first, but the way the room had fallen into an even heavier silence made something click in his mind. Reynolds sat back, watching as realization settled over him like a weight. "Oh, now you get it." Walker's pulse picked up, his confidence taking its first real hit. He knew that name. Everyone in the industry did. Nathaniel Carter was a force in the business world, a billionaire whose influence stretched across multiple industries, including this airline. Reynolds let the moment sink in before speaking again. "Nathaniel Carter personally called me. He didn't call customer service. He didn't call PR, he called me directly." He let out a slow, measured breath, his expression grim. "Do you know what he told me?" Walker didn't answer. Reynolds leaned in slightly, his voice cold. "That he will make sure you never fly a plane again." Walker felt something tighten in his chest, but he forced himself to straighten his shoulders, refusing to show weakness. You're done." Walker's mouth snapped shut. Reynolds stood up, adjusting his jacket with a finality that sent ice down Walker's spine. "Hand over your badge. Your career with this airline is over." Walker sat there, stunned, the weight of his actions finally crashing down on him. For the first time in his career, he realized he wasn't untouchable. The door to the boardroom swung open, and for the first time in his life, Richard Walker felt real fear. Nathaniel Carter stepped inside, his presence shifting the air in the room like a storm rolling in. He wasn't a man who needed to announce himself. His reputation had already done that. His tailored black suit was immaculate, his sharp eyes unreadable, but the energy radiating off him was lethal. Every executive at the table straightened instinctively, their gazes darting between Walker and the billionaire whose daughter had just been publicly humiliated. Walker's throat went dry. He had seen Nathaniel Carter on television, in business magazines, had heard his name spoken in the highest circles of corporate power, but seeing him in person was different. The weight of his presence was suffocating. Nathaniel's expression was disturbingly calm as he stepped forward, his voice smooth but laced with steel. "You don't know who you just put your hands on." Walker opened his mouth, but no words came out. Nathaniel took another step, folding his hands in front of him with practiced patience. "You thought you were making a point, didn't you? Putting her in her place." His voice never rose, but it carried an authority that made every word feel like a threat. "I've dealt with men like you my entire life, men who think power means control, men who mistake arrogance for authority." Walker felt the blood drain from his face. Nathaniel cocked his head slightly, studying him like something beneath his notice. "I could destroy you with a single phone call." Walker tensed, his fingers clenching into fists under the table. He wanted to push back, to assert some level of dominance, but there was nothing left to cling to. He had already lost. Nathaniel turned his gaze to David Reynolds, who had remained silent, watching everything unfold like a man waiting for the final blow. "I assume this man no longer works for you." Reynolds didn't hesitate. "Effective immediately." Walker flinched as the words landed like a gunshot. Nathaniel nodded, satisfied. "Good." He turned his attention back to Walker, his expression unreadable. "You thought throwing my daughter off that plane would be the end of it, but I don't believe in letting things slide." Walker's breath came short, panic creeping in. "I was just following protocol," he blurted, his voice hoarse, desperate. "She refused to move." Nathaniel's eyes flashed, his voice cutting like a blade. "You put your hands on her." Walker recoiled slightly, his mouth opening and closing, but no excuse would save him now. Nathaniel exhaled slowly, his expression hardening. "You'll never work in aviation again." Walker's jaw locked, his body stiff, but there was no fight left to give. Nathaniel turned back to Reynolds, his tone shifting into something sharper. "This doesn't end with Walker. A pilot like him doesn't operate in isolation. I want a full-scale investigation into your hiring practices, into every discrimination complaint that's been ignored, into every black passenger who has been quietly reassigned from first class." Reynolds nodded once. "It's already in motion." Nathaniel studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Good." He adjusted the cuffs of his suit, his presence still filling the room with an unspoken command. "Make sure the world knows this airline is cleaning house. If you don't, I will." Reynolds swallowed. "Understood." Nathaniel didn't spare Walker another glance as he turned and strode toward the exit. Walker remained frozen, his career, his authority, his carefully built reputation crumbling around him. He had spent years believing he was untouchable, that power was his birthright. But today he learned what real power looked like, and it had just walked out the door, leaving him with nothing. Olivia sat in her father's private office, her phone still buzzing with notifications. The scandal had gone global, news anchors debated it, late-night hosts mocked it, the airline's stock had taken a nosedive overnight. Their PR team had issued a sterile apology, but it wasn't enough. It was never enough. She had seen it before, how corporations managed these crises with empty statements, a promise to do better, and a quiet hope that people would move on. But this time, she wasn't going to let that happen. Nathaniel sat across from her, his expression unreadable as he skimmed the latest reports. "The airline wants to settle," he said, setting the papers down. His tone was calm, but she knew him too well. He was waiting to see what she would do. Olivia exhaled sharply, leaning back in her chair. "Of course they do. They're offering a public apology, financial compensation, and a promise of new diversity initiatives." Nathaniel continued, watching her carefully. "They want this to disappear." She scoffed, shaking her head. "Of course they do." She turned her phone over in her palm, the words from strangers still fresh in her mind. "This happened to me. This happened to my mother. This happens every day." She met her father's gaze, her voice steady. "If I settle, this happens again, to someone without my resources, without a last name that makes CEOs pick up the phone." Her throat tightened as she thought about all the people who never got this kind of attention, who were humiliated and forgotten because they didn't have an audience watching. No, they don't get to buy their way out of this. I want them in court. Nathaniel's lips pressed together, but his eyes gleamed with something close to approval. "Good," he said simply. Her lawyer, Lisa Morgan, a sharp, relentless litigator known for taking on corporate giants, nodded. "Then we go to war." The lawsuit was filed within 24 hours. Olivia Carter, V. Ace, Horizon Airlines, and Captain Richard Walker. The charges: racial discrimination, unlawful removal, and assault. It was a case that could set a precedent, one that the airline's legal team would fight tooth and nail to avoid losing. The media frenzy exploded. The lawsuit wasn't just about one incident, it was about an entire industry's pattern of discrimination. Legal analysts weighed in, calling it the biggest racial discrimination case against an airline in decades. Activists called for reforms. Former employees and passengers came forward with their own stories, piling onto the airline's growing PR nightmare. Walker, still reeling from his sudden downfall, was in hiding. Reporters camped outside his house, digging into his history. The more they uncovered, the worse it got. Old complaints from black flight attendants resurfaced, claims that he had made offhand racist remarks, subtle policies designed to keep certain passengers from first class. He wasn't an anomaly. He was the symptom of a much larger disease. Olivia remained silent through it all, ignoring the desperate requests for interviews. She had one focus now: winning, not just for herself, but for every person who had been quietly forced to accept humiliation because they didn't have the power to fight back. She would make sure they never had to accept it again. The courtroom was packed, the tension so thick it felt like the walls themselves were holding their breath. Rows of reporters sat in the gallery, pens poised, cameras flashing every time Olivia Carter entered. Protesters gathered outside, their voices carrying through the air, chanting, "Justice for Olivia," while holding signs demanding accountability from Horizon Airlines. Inside, the judge, a stern-looking woman with sharp eyes, called the session to order. The moment had finally come. Olivia sat at the plaintiff's table, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. To her right, Lisa Morgan, her attorney, exuded the quiet confidence of a woman who had already decided she was going to win. Across the aisle, Richard Walker sat stiffly in his chair, his once proud shoulders slumped, his face pale under the fluorescent lights. The prosecution wasted no time presenting the most damning piece of evidence: the surveillance footage from the plane. The courtroom fell into a hush as the video played on the large screen. The grainy black and white footage showed the moment Walker approached Olivia, his posture aggressive, his voice sharp. The audio, pulled from nearby passenger recordings, played over the footage, crystal clear. "Listen, sweetheart, first class isn't for people like you." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Even those who had already seen the viral clip reacted as if hearing it for the first time. The judge's expression hardened. Members of the jury shifted in their seats, their faces unreadable but tense. Then came the footage of Walker grabbing Olivia's shoulder, the forceful shove, the sharp tearing of her dress as security pulled her away. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of Olivia's heels dragging against the aisle floor. Lisa let the video play all the way through, the final frame freezing on Walker standing with his arms crossed, watching Olivia being dragged away as if she were nothing more than an inconvenience. When the screen went dark, Lisa rose from her seat, walking deliberately toward the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice steady, razor-sharp, "what you just witnessed was not a misunderstanding. It was not an issue of protocol. It was a calculated act of discrimination. A man in a position of power made a decision not based on safety, not based on airline policy, but based on the color of my client's skin." Walker's lawyer, a seasoned defense attorney named Charles Holt, stood quickly, trying to regain control. "Objection, Your Honor. This is speculation." The judge barely glanced at him. "Overruled." Lisa turned toward Walker now, her expression unreadable. "Captain Walker, let's talk about what really happened that day." Walker swallowed, his jaw tightening. "I was following airline policy," he said, his voice strained but still clinging to authority. Lisa arched a brow, tilting her head slightly. And does airline policy encourage removing passengers who have confirmed first-class tickets? Walker hesitated. There was a mix-up. Lisa took a slow step forward, flipping through a file on her desk. Let me help you out. According to Horizon Airlines' official seating policy, once a first-class seat is confirmed, it cannot be reassigned without passenger consent unless there is a clear security risk. Walker shifted uncomfortably. She was being uncooperative. Lisa nodded. Uncooperative? You mean she refused to move from the seat she paid for? Walker's mouth pressed into a thin line. Yes. Lisa let the words settle in the air for a moment before delivering the next blow. And when other passengers refuse to move due to seating errors, do you always call security and have them forcibly removed? Or was this a special case? Walker didn't answer. Lisa took another step, lowering her voice just enough to make the jury lean in. Captain Walker, would you have reacted the same way if Olivia Carter had been a white woman? Holt jumped up again. Objection. Lisa turned to the judge. Your Honor, Captain Walker's own words in that footage demonstrate his bias. This is a question of motive. The judge nodded. I'll allow it. Walker exhaled, his fingers gripping the table. I don't see color, he said stiffly. Lisa smirked, shaking her head as she reached into her folder and pulled out a transcript. Oh, but you did, because according to at least 3 separate passengers, when my client pushed back on your unlawful demand, you told her, and I quote, "First class isn't for people like you." So tell us, Captain, who exactly did you mean by people like you? Walker's face flushed, his composure cracking. His lawyer leaned over, whispering something urgent, but the damage was already done. The jury had heard enough. Lisa turned back to the jury, her voice smooth but firm. You don't have to wonder what was in Captain Walker's mind that day. He told us. He told Olivia. And now the world knows too. She stepped back, her work for the day complete. Walker sat rigid, his hands trembling under the table. For the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to lose control. The jury filed back into the courtroom, their faces unreadable, their movements slow but deliberate. The air was thick with tension, the kind that settled deep into the bones, making every second stretch longer than it should. Olivia sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her expression composed. Lisa Morgan sat beside her, her back straight, her presence steady as ever. Across the aisle, Richard Walker sat rigid, his fingers tapping nervously against the table. He no longer carried the smug confidence he had walked in with. His crisp uniform had been replaced with a cheap suit, his arrogance stripped layer by layer throughout the trial. The judge, her expression severe, glanced at the jury foreman. Has the jury reached a verdict? The foreman, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, stood holding the slip of paper in his hand. Yes, Your Honor, we have. A hush settled over the room. Even the reporters, usually whispering into their recorders or furiously typing on their laptops, had gone silent. The foreman cleared his throat, unfolding the paper slowly, his voice even but firm. In the case of Olivia Carter versus Captain Richard Walker and Horizon Airlines, on the charge of racial discrimination, we find the defendant guilty. A ripple of murmurs spread across the courtroom. Walker's shoulders tensed. His lawyer, Charles Holt, inhaled sharply, but there was no protest, no outburst, just the reality of the moment settling in. The foreman continued. On the charge of assault, we find the defendant guilty. Olivia exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of every injustice she had ever endured. Every moment she had been forced to swallow her anger, lift her chin and walk away. Not this time. This time the system had worked the way it was supposed to. Walker clenched his jaw, his eyes darting toward the judge, as if searching for an escape route that no longer existed. The judge nodded solemnly before addressing the defendant. Captain Walker, the court has reviewed all evidence, including surveillance footage, passenger testimonies, and your own recorded statements. Your actions were not only inappropriate but deeply discriminatory. Your blatant disregard for professional conduct and the dignity of another human being is unacceptable, especially for someone in a position of authority. Therefore, I hereby sentence you to 12 months in federal prison. Gasps erupted from the spectators. A reporter in the back whispered, 12 months. They actually sentenced him. Walker stiffened, his mouth slightly open in shock. The judge wasn't finished. Furthermore, Horizon Airlines will face civil liability for discrimination, unlawful removal, and emotional distress damages totaling in excess of $50 million in lawsuits. The airline is also mandated to implement anti-discrimination policies, mandatory bias training for employees, and an overhaul of its leadership hiring process within the next fiscal year. The entire courtroom seemed to be processing the gravity of the verdict all at once. Walker finally snapped, 12 months? For what? For doing my damn job? His voice cracked as he turned toward his lawyer. Do something. Holt closed his briefcase, his expression unreadable. There's nothing to do. Walker let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. This is a joke. The judge's voice cut through his protest. The only joke here, Captain Walker, is the fact that you ever believed you could act this way without consequence. The bailiff approached Walker, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. Walker stiffened, his face flushing with anger, but he didn't resist. Not anymore. Olivia watched as he was led away, his once proud posture now heavy with the realization that his life would never be the same. Lisa turned to Olivia, a small, knowing smile on her lips. It's done. But Olivia wasn't smiling. She didn't feel relief. Not yet. Because this had never been just about her. This was about every black person who had ever been told they didn't belong, and the fight was far from over. The press conference room was packed, cameras flashing, reporters murmuring among themselves as they waited for Olivia Carter to step up to the podium. The tension in the air was electric, charged with the weight of everything that had unfolded in the past few weeks. The trial, the verdict, the downfall of Captain Richard Walker, the massive lawsuits against Horizon Airlines. It had all led to this moment. When Olivia finally emerged, the room fell into silence. She was poised, composed, dressed in a sleek black suit that made her look every bit the powerhouse she was. She didn't need a written speech, didn't need rehearsed lines. She had been preparing for this moment her entire life. She placed her hands on the podium, her gaze sweeping across the room before she spoke. I want to start by saying this. I never wanted to be here. Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a quiet fire simmering beneath the surface. I never wanted to be the center of a media storm, the face of yet another fight for basic human dignity. I was just trying to go home. I had a confirmed first-class ticket. I followed every rule, and still, I was told I didn't belong. And the reason for that had nothing to do with policy. It had nothing to do with airline regulations. It had everything to do with race. The silence in the room was absolute. Olivia let her words settle before continuing, her voice gaining strength. This isn't just about me. This is about every black person who's ever been told they don't belong. It's about the silent moments of discrimination that never make the news, the passengers who didn't have their phones recording when it happened to them, the people who were forced to accept humiliation because they didn't have the resources to fight back. I am here today because I refuse to let this story end with me. A murmur spread through the crowd, reporters furiously taking notes, camera shutters clicking in rapid succession. Olivia took a breath, her jaw tightening slightly. Horizon Airlines wants to move forward. They want to apologize, pay a settlement, implement new diversity training, and hope the world forgets. But let me be clear, this is bigger than one airline. This is about an entire industry. An industry that has long treated people of color as second-class passengers, whether it's through racial profiling, random security checks, or the quiet, unspoken policies that keep us from fully existing in spaces that were never built for us in the first place. She stepped away from the podium, letting her words sink in before she continued. Change is coming, and not because of a corporate press release or a new training module, but because the public is demanding it, because the people who have been ignored for too long are finally being heard. Her father stood in the background, arms crossed, his expression unreadable, but she knew he was proud. She turned back to the cameras, her voice steady, unwavering. I am not interested in apologies without action. I am not here to be a headline for a week and then forgotten. I am here to make sure that this never happens again. Not to me, not to anyone." The room erupted into questions, reporters shouting over one another, but Olivia had already said what she needed to say. She turned, walking off the stage, leaving behind the weight of the past and stepping into the fight for the future. Olivia sat in her office, the city skyline stretching out beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. The golden hues of the setting sun cast long shadows across her desk, but she barely noticed. Her laptop screen glowed in front of her, filled with notes, legal drafts, policy recommendations, everything she had been working on since the trial ended. Winning in court wasn't enough. A guilty verdict didn't change an industry, but policy did, systems did. Her fingers moved quickly over the keyboard, refining her proposal. Mandatory anti-bias training for all flight crew, a standardized reporting system for racial discrimination complaints, stricter consequences for employees who engage in racial profiling, transparency in first-class seating assignments, stronger protections for passengers removed from flights. She wasn't just writing reforms for Horizon Airlines. She was drafting a movement. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She glanced up to see her father leaning against the frame, arms crossed, a knowing look on his face. Nathaniel Carter rarely gave praise outright, but she saw it in the way his eyes softened slightly as he stepped inside. "You still working?" he said, more observation than question. Olivia exhaled, sitting back in her chair. "There's more to do." Nathaniel nodded, glancing at the screen before looking back at her. "You didn't just win, Olivia," he said. "You changed the game." For a long moment, she simply held his gaze, letting the weight of his words settle over her. She had spent her whole life chasing victories, breaking barriers, proving herself in rooms where she wasn't expected to be. But this was different. This wasn't just her fight anymore. She turned back to the screen, her determination solidifying. "Then let's make sure it stays changed." The next day, Olivia stood at another podium, cameras flashing, reporters watching her every move. But this time she wasn't just reacting to an injustice. She was leading the charge to prevent the next one. She looked directly into the lens, her voice strong, unwavering. "How many others never get the chance to fight back?" she asked. "How many people are silenced before they can even tell their story? The problem isn't just what happened to me. The problem is that it keeps happening." She let the silence stretch for a moment, her words hanging heavy in the air. "This isn't over," she said, "not until no one else has to wonder if they belong." And with that, she stepped away, walking forward, knowing the fight was only just beginning. The camera remained focused on Olivia as she stood at the podium, the press conference room now quiet, the weight of her words still hanging in the air. She took a breath, letting her gaze sweep over the faces before her. This wasn't just about her victory. It was about the reality that stretched far beyond her own experience. "Let's talk about what this really means," she said, her voice steady, deliberate. "Let's talk about what would have happened if I wasn't Olivia Carter." A murmur rippled through the audience. "If I wasn't a billionaire," she continued, "if my last name didn't carry weight, if I didn't have the resources to fight back, do you think this story would have played out the same way?" She let the question settle, watching as some of the reporters exchanged glances, some shifting uncomfortably. "The truth is, this isn't about me," she went on. "It's about the thousands of black passengers who face this kind of discrimination every single day. The ones who don't have a million people watching when they're humiliated, the ones who don't have a high-powered legal team to take their case to court, the ones who get kicked off flights, told to move, treated like they don't belong, without a single camera roll." She reached for a stack of papers beside her, lifting them slightly. "In the last 2 weeks, I've received over 3,000 messages from people sharing their own experiences. Parents who were told they couldn't sit with their children, business professionals denied upgrades they paid for, families forced off flights for being too loud, students questioned about their tickets as if they couldn't possibly afford them." She shook her head, her jaw tightening. "This isn't an isolated incident, this is a pattern." She let the papers drop back onto the podium with a quiet thud. "And I have to ask," she continued, her tone hardening, How many of these stories do you think would have ended with justice? How many of these passengers got a trial? Got an apology? Got anything at all besides a refund and a reminder that in spaces like these, they are not seen as equal? She exhaled sharply, leaning forward slightly. We need to stop acting like these are rare occurrences. The only thing rare about what happened to me is that I had the resources to fight back, and that should terrify you. She let those words linger, then took a step back, gripping the sides of the podium. I have one question for all of you, she said, her voice quieter now, but just as firm. If you were on that plane, would you have spoken up, or would you have stayed silent? She scanned the room, watching the shifting expressions, the way some reporters looked down at their notepads, the way others held her gaze. She continued, her voice unwavering. Because the truth is, most people stayed silent that night. They watched me get humiliated. They heard the words Walker said to me. They saw me being dragged off that flight. And almost no one spoke up. Her expression didn't waver. So, I'll ask you again. If you were sitting there, watching what happened to me unfold in real time, would you have said something? Or would you have looked away? A heavy silence filled the room. This isn't just about airlines, she said. This is about how discrimination thrives in the spaces where good people stay quiet. In moments where people decide it's easier to mind their business than to challenge what they know is wrong. She straightened, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone. I'm not here to make you comfortable, she said. I'm here to make you think. She let that settle before delivering her final words. If we really want change, it can't just be the people who experience discrimination fighting back. It has to be everyone. She stepped away from the podium, cameras still flashing, reporters still stunned into silence. She walked off the stage, her father waiting for her with a small nod of approval. And as she exited the room, the world was left with a question they couldn't ignore. Would you have spoken up? The camera lingered on the empty podium, the weight of Olivia's words still pressing into the silence of the room. Reporters were still processing, some furiously typing notes, others exchanging glances as if trying to find the right angle to frame what had just happened. The story had shifted. This wasn't just about a lawsuit anymore. It wasn't just about one woman, one airline, or one pilot. It was a wake-up call, a mirror held up to society, forcing people to ask themselves where they stood when injustice happened right in front of them. Outside the press conference, the crowd had grown. Protesters held up signs, their voices a steady hum of demands for accountability. Some were chanting justice for Olivia, but others had already moved beyond just her case. They were calling for airline reforms, for industry-wide policy changes, for an end to the unspoken rules that dictated who was seen as worthy of occupying certain spaces. The internet had erupted once again. Social media was flooded with conversations, videos of the press conference spreading like wildfire. Olivia's final question had struck a nerve. Would you have spoken up? Thousands of comments poured in, people arguing, reflecting, debating. Some admitted they had witnessed discrimination before and said nothing. Others shared stories of moments where they had spoken up and how it had cost them something: comfort, friendships, even their jobs. But the conversation was happening, and that was the first step. Inside her car, Olivia watched the notifications scroll across her screen, her mind still buzzing from the adrenaline of it all. She had done what she came to do. She had said what needed to be said, but she knew this wasn't the end. This fight wasn't over, and it never would be until real change happened. Her father sat beside her in the back seat, watching her carefully. "You started something today," he said after a moment. She glanced at him. "I know." He nodded, a small smile playing at the corner of his lips. "Now, let's see how far you can take it." She exhaled, turning her phone over in her hands. She didn't just want this to be another viral moment. She wanted it to mean something. So she lifted her phone, opened the camera, and hit record. "If you're watching this," she said, her voice steady, "I want you to do more than just listen. I want you to take action. Because the truth is, this isn't just my story. It's bigger than me. It's about every person who has ever been made to feel like they don't belong. And if you think this doesn't affect you, then you're not paying attention." She paused, her expression unwavering. "So, here's what I need from you. Speak up. If you see injustice happening, don't stay silent. Call it out, challenge it. And if you've ever been in a position where you could have spoken up and didn't, ask yourself why, and then promise yourself that next time you won't hesitate." She let the weight of her words sink in before delivering the final blow. Because silence is what keeps discrimination alive, and the only way we end it is by refusing to look the other way. She ended the recording and uploaded it immediately. Within minutes, the engagement skyrocketed. People weren't just watching, they were responding. They were tagging friends, having difficult conversations, vowing to be better. Olivia leaned back in her seat, feeling the momentum building beneath her. She had won her case, but more importantly, she had started something that couldn't be ignored. The movement. She turned to the camera one last time. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories of courage and change. Together, we can create a world where everyone's dignity is recognized and respected. Then she put her phone down, staring out the window as the city blurred past. This wasn't just about her anymore. And that's exactly how she wanted it.